Hello everyone, I welcome you to this part of the series that is launched by NLTI, where we will walk you through some of our content which will help you prepare for this exam in 2026 and in other future iterations of this paper. My name is Hemant and I've been associated with NLTI for about 3 years now. I personally have graduated from NLS recently and I sat for this exam in 2022. And I have a fair bit of experience working on content and working on different mentorship programs that NLTI has launched under their different coaching initiatives. Part of these sessions will cover for you how you can go through different components of this paper. So for instance, the first session in this series is going to cover reading comprehension passages for you, which is one of the most important aspects of part A. And in the future sessions, we'll go through different other parts such as critical reasoning, will cover general knowledge, will cover how to manage time in part A. We'll also be walking you through different parts of part B, in which how to read a question, how to make sense of a question. So the focus in all of these series is going to be familiarizing you with the contents of NLSAT, and also to ensure that for many of you who do not have access to paid material, you can easily familiarize yourself with the NLSAT paper pattern and what all things you need to keep in mind while you're preparing. It is also to be kept in mind that while many of these sessions are going to be helpful in equipping you with necessary tools to maybe attempt this paper, but these are not comprehensive in and of itself. So you must, at any point, if you feel you need more information, feel free to reach out to us on our website at nlti.com and you'll be able to see more information about it. So now I'll get on to the first session in this part of the series, which is reading comprehension strategies. Now, the first thing to keep in mind is that when you're appearing for an LSAT, there are two parts in it. There is a part A and there is a part B. Part A has gained more significance in the recent times because the part A tends to be way more competitive. There are more number of students who are sitting in part A as opposed to part B. And also part A is that component of this paper which will factor into the final merit list, which means that your score in part A plus part B cumulatively will decide how well you do in this paper. Also, because part A is objective, unlike part B, which is subjective, you have a better chance at scoring in part A. You may not be entirely familiar with what to write in part B to score maximum marks, but in part A, you certainly know what you need to do to score maximum marks. So that's why focusing on part A and an emphasis on part A is very important, because it's probably the easiest and the most certain scoring component of this paper that you can deal with. Now, what we're going to look at in this comprehension strategy session is that one, how do you start with a passage? So you'll have about 8 passages in part A. All the passages generally tend to be taken either from a newspaper editorial, or they might be from a magazine, or they could be a op-ed piece. They could be possibly a short story taken from some magazine or a book or a novel. So these are typically very engaging excerpts taken from different sources, and you're supposed to, and they're roughly around 500 to 600 words in length, so they're quite comprehensive and they're quite lengthy as well. And many a times students face difficulty at 2 levels. First is to understand what's written in the passage, and the second is how to cover that passage in a way that is effective and a way that it also saves your time. So this session is, I'm going to help you deal with both of these things. One, how to actually go through the content, and second, how to actually make sense of what the content is in a way that it's efficient from a time management point of view. Alright, so let's start with the basic reading that you need to do when a passage is in front of you and what all you need to keep in mind. The objective for us when we look at a passage is that we need to quickly understand what's where in the passage. So the basic and elementary mistake that most of the students do when they're reading a passage is that they're reading it as if they have to absorb each and every piece of information given in the passage. Now that is a counterproductive strategy. The reason for that is because when you read a passage, you have to take about 50 seconds, or if it's a long passage, then maybe 60 seconds to skim the title, introduction, headings, if any, conclusion, all that. What it basically means, this entire first line, it means is that go through point A to point Z in the passage, and after you're done with it, the objective is not that if somebody were to ask you what's written in the passage, you can tell it by memory. That's not our objective. All you need to know is what is where in the passage. So once you read your question, if the question asks you which of the following is true as per the information provided in the passage, and there are 4 options in front of you, you know where each and every option has been taken from in the passage. So the passage is merely a reference point. You do not need to memorize, because a lot of times the reason students take a lot of time in reading the passage is because they're trying to memorize, they're trying to remember what's where in the passage. All you need to know is the reference points in the passage. That if I've read a passage, then which point comes from where. That is why this previewing is very important, which is to skim quickly through the passage so that when you're reading a question, you know precisely where the answer to this question lies. So if this question is from, let's say, paragraph 2 of the passage, then you can go back to the paragraph 2 and then you can do a slightly more in-depth or perhaps a more careful reading of that passage. And the reason I say this is because if you start doing a careful reading of the passage from the get-go, from the very first moment when you saw the passage, the chances are very good that the points you looked at very carefully are not even asked in any question. So from a time management point of view, it's not very efficient for us to follow that strategy. So all we need to do is just know broadly what are the contents of the passage, and once we know that, then we can keep coming back to them as per what the question is asking us to do. That is what's more important. What you should avoid doing is that once you've read the passage and then you're reading a question, then you absolutely do not know where this question is being asked from. At that stage, you should not be scrambling for what's where. So it's very important that when you're previewing a passage, you know exactly which points are taken from which part of the passage. Now this is the second part, and some of the students have considered doing this strategy. So in your mock tests, you can perhaps use this and see if it works for you, which is that first you read the questions and then you go through the passage. In some cases it can work for you because eventually if you know what the question is asking, then you can accordingly read the passage and then you can see which points of the passage will help you answer the questions. The difficulty with this strategy is that maybe you will not remember each and every question. There are about 5 to 6 critical reasoning / English questions in each and every passage. So, but it's nonetheless a helpful strategy if in case you want to experiment, and for some students that I have interacted with have told me that this strategy has also equally worked for them. So it's perhaps helpful, but the one that I just discussed with you, which is skimming through the passage quickly, is certainly one of the important ones that you should keep in mind. Now, these are the strategies to have in mind when you're reading a passage, and this is important as well because you must know what parts of the passage are more important for you when you're going through it. Maybe you're taking about 50 seconds to finish reading a passage, or you're taking a minute and a half. But it's irrespective of how long it takes you to do that, it's important to have these strategies in mind. The first is that, as I just very quickly mentioned in the introduction of this video, is don't get bogged down in every detail. Look for the central argument or the message that the author is trying to convey. This is often found in introduction and conclusion. I'll tell you a very quick short trick. When you're reading a passage in NLSAT, every passage, wherever it's taken from, in its conclusion, below its conclusion where the passage is finishing, it's always linked with its source. That this passage is taken, let's say, from Indian Express, and alongside that, they'll also mention the title of the that excerpt from where it's taken from. So let's say there is an excerpt on Indian economy, and then it's taken from Indian Express. In its below its conclusion where the passage is finishing, it will mention the source of that article, that this article is taken from Indian Express, and the heading of the title is also given. Read that heading before you start the passage, because once you read the heading, you will know exactly what this passage is speaking about. For example, if the passage is about caregiving by mothers, and if you start reading the passage, you may not know exactly what you're reading, and that's a problem many students face, because once you dive into a passage without knowing what its heading is, because the luxury we have when we are reading a newspaper is we know the heading and then we know what to expect out of this passage. But in the exam, we do not know the heading. So that's why look at the source of that passage. Where is it taken from? And read the heading of that passage. If you know the heading, it already sets up the right tone. You know exactly what to expect. If the heading of the passage is downfall Indian economy, then when you start reading the passage, you'll know exactly what to expect. So that's one tip that I would give you. The second is that it's not necessary for you to get bogged down into every specific detail. Look for the main things that the passage is highlighting. So every passage, the author has written something in that passage. They're trying to put forth a point. Our focus is to make sure or to excavate that main point that the author is trying to make. And in and around that, there may be other things that the author is discussing, but our central focus should be at looking at what is the main idea that the author is discussing. So that's why in any passage, there are lots of details that will be provided to you. Make sure that your focus is towards the main argument author is making. In that, also keep in mind that usually that main idea will be provided to you somewhere either in introduction or in the conclusion. If you're reading the introduction and you're still clueless about what the author is trying to say, then do not feel that you have not been able to make sense of the passage. Scroll down a little bit further. As you'll go towards conclusion, you'll find what the author is trying to argue or what the author's main argument is. In between introduction and conclusion, author is perhaps discussing and elaborating their main argument. But if you just want to know quickly what the main argument is, as I said to you, because there is no shortcut to perhaps know what the main argument is, but the easiest way to gather it is through either introduction or conclusion. Second, as I said, author is going to make some important argument. For example, the passages, let's say, about Indian economy and the downfall in the Indian economy. Author is making an argument that the reason behind the downfall in Indian economy is due to the lack of focus on manufacturing sector and overemphasis on service sector. If this is the main argument author is making, author is likely to have some other supporting arguments as well. That's the second part of our focus on reading a passage, which is pay attention to how the author supports their main idea. And the way to figure that out is to look at things or words like because, however, yet, conversely, or moreover. These are basically transition words. Highlight this for yourself. Look out for transition words because these are the words which will basically help you understand what the author is trying you to focus on. Because anytime the author is using word like yet or however or any other words, these are just illustrations for you. These are not exhaustive, but there can be more number of words that the author is using. Focus on those things because they'll eventually help you understand what all the supporting arguments author is using to build their main argument. Now, you must all be thinking, why is it all of this so important? The reason this is important is because if you know what the supporting argument says, what is the main argument, all your critical reasoning questions will be based on these things only. The critical reasoning questions are not going to test you so much on things like mathematical reasoning, but it's going to test you on things like how well have you understood the substance of the passage. So that's why it's important to keep an eye out for these words. Second is to look at being wary of absolute statements. So we discussed how to identify supporting arguments, but also look out for absolute statements, which is that authors rarely use absolutes like always, never, which is that any passage will very rarely use words like India has always been a great country or India's never had a great president or something like that. Authors will never use such words. What they will use is they'll use qualifiers like often, generally, which indicate a more nuanced viewpoint. So when you're reading a passage, keep an eye out, or perhaps you can also underline these things, which is that if author is somewhere used always, underline that because it's very rare for authors to use it, and if they've used it, then there may be a question which can perhaps ask you something along these lines. That's why look out for words like often or generally because it's very unlikely that authors will use absolute statements. They'll always use qualifiers. These two strategies are from a time management point of view. So we have discussed the first three from understanding the substance of the passage, but these two are purely from making your reading more efficient. Do not sub-vocalize. What that means is that when you're reading a passage, for example, you're reading that the desire to create is one of the deepest earnings of human soul. What most of the students do is they start mumbling. If you mumble, it'll take more time. It's very natural. Instead, if you were to read it in your mind, you'll read much faster. So that's why when you're reading a passage and it comes to many students very subconsciously, they're not able to recognize that they're wasting their time by mumbling each and every word written in the passage. So try to read it in your mind. You'll save a lot more time if you do that. Second is annotate wherever it's necessary. So all these things that I've discussed with you, which is identifying supporting arguments or being wary of absolute statements, or if you feel that somewhere author's main idea is written so you want to underline, in all of that, annotate the passage. Underline the key points, circle the main ideas. If you feel somewhere something is written which you would like to keep an eye out for, underline that. Annotation is very important for two reasons. One is it certainly helps you identify what's important and what's not. Second, whatever you annotate, it tends to stick in your mind. So you'll remember exactly what is more important for you if you're annotating those portions. I have taken a few sample passages because all of what I've discussed with you right now is just in theory. So let's just put it into practice and see how you can do this. This passage is an example of transition words basically. which is that how to identify the transition words which are important and why they're so significant. So for example, if you're reading this passage, this is about when the cabinet was proposing to increase the legal minimum age of marriage for women from 18 to 21. So in this, I have highlighted the word like yet. And the reason this is because this passage starts, or paragraph starts with saying, why isn't it feasible? The law prohibiting marriage below the age of 18 has been in effect in some form since the 19th, yet child marriage has persisted virtually. So this is important because it does admit that there is a law which prohibits marriage below 18. However, despite that law, child marriage has persisted. So you can see there is a change in tone. That's why the words like yet are important. Because even though the passage admits that there is a law which prohibits child marriages below 18, yet that law has failed. That's why a word like yet is important, because it marks a change in the tone of the author. And that's where a nuanced viewpoint comes in. So that's why transition words are important, because they introduce the nuance in the passage, which you will not be able to identify otherwise. Same goes for here, which is even though, another transition word, which is that even though more than 1 in 5 marriages take place below age 18, hardly any violations of the act appear in our criminal records, which is that very few marriages have happened below 18. Despite that, those violations have not appeared in our criminal record. So again, the use of word even though is marking a contradiction in how, despite marriages below 18 are happening, but they are not appearing in the criminal records. Again, it's a transition word. It signifies some kind of contrast that the author is trying to introduce. Again, of course, is also a very minor transitionary word. Again, you can look at moreover, which is again a transition word. So you can just pause this video for a while and go through these entire excerpt that I've taken from a passage and look at how these transition words are playing out. I've given you an example above. Let's look at sample passage 2. This is a very brief example of how you can annotate and how you can skim through a passage without exactly reading a passage. What it means is that there are many words in a passage, but not all of them are equally important. There are only some of them which are important for our purposes. So that's why when we're reading any of these passages, we can practically read a passage without actually reading each and every single word, or actually getting bogged down with the details provided in each and every single sentence. So I have highlighted some of these portions over here, and I've highlighted them to show you how, if you were to read this passage from here till here, and you'll read that passage in its entirety with each and every single word, then you will take away the same amount of knowledge as you would take away if you were to only read the red highlighted portions. Because the thing is, we are not reading a passage to perhaps write a subjective answer. That's not our objective. We only have to read a passage to answer some objective question. So for efficiency point of view, we want to reduce our time as much as we can. So that's why if you were to read this passage I think is largely about back when Israel, even though it's still ongoing, the Israel-Palestine conflict, and South Africa had charged them with the genocide before International Court of Justice. So now, if you were to only read these red highlighted portions, which is South Africa's case, Israel charged Israel with genocide, Lemkin, who is a scholar, the architect of Genocide Convention, the state of Israel, state sanctioned blah blah blah, faces a credible charge of genocide. This whole paragraph basically summed up into 5 to 6 words. South Africa's case, Israel with genocide, basically they have charged them with genocide. Here is a scholar. Why is this scholar important? Because they are the architect of Genocide Convention. State of Israel faces a credible charge of genocide. That's it. This whole passage is talking about why Israel is facing a charge of genocide and what a certain scholar has to say about that. In the second line, we'll discuss those things, which is that indiscriminate killings, war crime in itself, indiscriminate killings by Israeli, war crime, Lemkin, genocide refers to, and then this part is important because it's put under these two comments. So that's why you can practically read an entire passage by only focusing on these things. So I've only focused on the words like indiscriminate killings by Israeli, which is a war crime in itself, and then the scholar refers to those indiscriminate killings in the following way. So that is underlined. So now I need not go through the whole passage in its entirety. It's not important for us. All we need to look at is these important words and then go through it. Now, if your question is how do we know what is important, maybe initially none of you will know what to highlight, what not to. One, it comes with a slight bit of practice. The more number of mock tests that you give, you understand which parts are more important. And second is, when you're going through it, there are a lot of words which are not very important. So things like in which provisional measures were announced on January 26, blah, 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 is a marker of Middle East conflict. Maybe Middle East conflict you can underline raging currently and all. Posits a moral prism to the viewpoint, to the view, the competing narratives. All these things are descriptive. They're describing something, but they're not very important for us to understand what the passage is saying. We only need to know what the passage is saying broadly, and then we read the questions and then we see exactly what the question is asking. So that's why these things, even though if you were to read a newspaper, they might appear important to you, but not for our purposes when we are going through this passage. So this is basically in practice skimming for you. This is another example of skimming. So you can again pause the video and look at all the red highlighted portions, and then you can see the video again. So you can read from point here to point here, and then you see how you will get the same gist of this passage if you were to read only the red highlighted portions. So you can perhaps just pause this video and do this exercise for yourself of how you can get better at skimming. You can practice this in your free time by picking up any newspaper article as well. Now this is the last bit, which is how to go about after reading, which is once you're done with the passage, do not reread. By reread, I mean that if the question is asking you certain thing, go back to the passage and then only read the relevant parts of the passage. Do not start reading the passage again. That's a fatal mistake, and that shows that you've not really, even if you were skimming on the first go, you've not been able to do that properly either. So avoid rereading the whole passage, only reread the relevant excerpts from the passage. Second, use the context clues from the questions to pinpoint relevant sections in the passage for reference, which is that if the question is, let's say, asking you, author has said so and so, which of the following statements is most likely to be true based on that, pick the keywords that the question uses and use those keywords to go back to the passage and see where that lies. So if the question uses some words, then see where those words are being used in the passage. So that way you will know exactly what is relevant and what you need to read from the passage, and not the whole passage. So that is also equally important. Use the question as a cue to find the answer. See the keywords that are used in the question and then go back to the passage. I've already told you how to go about skimming. This is a more theoretical illustration of how you can go about skimming. So you can just briefly again pause and read these things, but I have given you a practical layout of how you go about skimming. So that concludes our first session for us, which is about reading comprehension passages and how you can understand the substance of those passages and how you can also efficiently read them by saving time. So thank you for watching this video, and stay tuned for the rest of the videos that we'll be launching. Thank you.